What if the most terrifying force in the galaxy wasn't the one conquering worlds, but the one so broken it had to be locked away in a prison of its own making? Somewhere in the void between stars, beyond the reach of the Astronomican's dying light, there exists a sphere. Not a planet, not a station. A perfect shell of living metal, impossibly vast, wrapped around a dying sun like a coffin sealed with prayers and terror. Inside this prison, something moves. Something that once walked among gods. Something that devoured entire star systems not with weapons, but with hunger itself. The Necrons call it the Outsider. The Eldar whisper of it in prophecies they dare not speak aloud. And humanity, in its cosmic ignorance, has no idea it exists at all. This is not a story about conquest. This is not a tale of glory or redemption. This is the story of what happens when a god goes mad. Long before the Emperor walked Terra, before the first human ever looked up at the stars with wonder, the universe belonged to different masters. The old ones shaped life itself like clay, crafting species and souls with the casual arrogance of artists who never considered their work might one day judge them. And in the cold spaces between their garden worlds, another intelligence stirred. The Necrontyr, a race cursed with brief, painful lives under a sun that burned with radiation, looked upon the Old One's immortality with eyes full of envy that curdled into hate. But the Necrontyr were not alone in their resentment. In the Materium's deepest layers, where reality grows thin and strange, ancient entities fed on stellar radiation and the electromagnetic sounds of suns, the Ctan, star gods. Vast, incomprehensible beings of living energy that had existed since the universe's first light cooled enough to cast shadows. They did not think as mortals think. They did not want as flesh wants. They simply were, eternal and alien, drifting through the cosmos like cosmic serpents through an infinite ocean. The Necrontyr found them, and in their desperation, made them an offer. Bodies of living metal, necrodermis, indestructible and eternal, in exchange for the power to wage war against the Old Ones. The Can accepted, pouring their vast consciousness into forms they could barely comprehend, like oceans forced into bottles. For the first time in their existence, they knew limitation. They knew shape. And with shape came something new, something that Tan had never experienced in their billions of years of existence. They discovered hunger. Not the hunger of the body, the hunger of the soul. The Ctan, now wearing flesh of a kind, found that the life force of mortal beings tasted sweeter than any stellar radiation. The essence of souls became their ambrosia, their addiction, their obsession. And chief among them, perhaps the most powerful, perhaps simply the most curious, was the one who would become the Outsider. Before its fall, it bore a different name, whispered in frequency spectrums that would shatter human minds. But names cease to matter when you become a warning. The war in heaven raged. The Catan and their Necron slaves shattered the Old One's empire, fragmenting reality itself in their fury. Entire species were consumed, their souls devoured like delicacies at a feast of extinction. But the Can's hunger grew with every meal, insatiable and maddening. They turned on each other, great shards of godhood colliding in battles that made galaxies tremble. And here, in this moment of cosmic cannibalism, something unprecedented occurred. The being that would become the Outsider began to devour its own kind. One by one, it consumed other Ctan, not in battle, not in conquest, in something closer to madness. Each fragment of star god consciousness it absorbed brought new perspective, new hunger, new horror. Imagine containing multitudes, but those multitudes are gods who hate each other, who fear each other, who remember being whole and separate and now exist as screaming fragments trapped in a single impossibly vast mind. The Outsider didn't just eat the other Catan, it became them, all of them. A chorus of divine insanity singing in frequencies that could crack planets. The Necrons watched their supposed masters descend into this cannibalistic frenzy and realized, perhaps too late, that they had not gained allies. They had created monsters. And so they turned. these soulless legions of living metal, and they shattered the can themselves. Using weapons that could crack the fundamental forces of reality, they broke the star gods into shards, fragments of their former terrible glory, and imprisoned these pieces across the galaxy in tesseract labyrinths and dimensional prisons. But the outsider was different. By the time the Necrons moved against it, it had consumed so many of its kindred that shattering it would have been like trying to break a hurricane. Worse, it knew what was coming. The accumulated consciousness of a dozen devoured tan screaming warnings in its crystalline mind gave it something none of its kind had ever possessed. It knew fear. And in that fear, it ran. Not across the stars, into them. The outsider found a yellow star in a forgotten corner of the galaxy and began to build. Using technology that predated the concept of science, it wove a shell around the sun, layer upon layer of living metal, quantum-locked polymers, and materials that exist in states of matter physics has no names for. A Dyson sphere, yes, but calling it merely that is like calling a supernova merely warm. This was a prison and fortress combined, a place where the outsider could hide from the Necros' vengeance, and perhaps more importantly, hide from itself. Inside this sphere, wrapped in the light of a captive star, the outsider continues its existence. Millions of years have passed since it sealed itself away. The war in heaven ended. The Necrons went into their long sleep. The Eldar rose and fell. Humanity crawled from old Earth and claimed the stars with flags and prayers. And through it all, the sphere has remained, a mystery at the edge of charted space, avoided by instinct even by species that have no record of why it should be feared. But here is what keeps the Eldar Farseers awake during their meditations, what makes even the Necron overlords pause in their calculations. The outsider is not dormant. It is not sleeping. Inside that sphere, the fractured god continues its eternal, maddening dialogue with itself, the voices of consumed Catan arguing, screaming, pleading, plotting. Some say it has gone completely insane, locked in a civil war with its own psyche. Others believe it achieved a kind of terrible enlightenment, understanding the universe from every possible angle of divine perception simultaneously. The truth, as always in this grim darkness, is worse than either possibility. The outsider is aware, and it is waiting. Waiting for what? Not even the oldest beings in the galaxy can say with certainty. But sometimes, very rarely, ships disappear near that region of space, not destroyed. Not scattered by warp storms or lost to navigational errors. They simply vanish, as if reality itself decided they shouldn't exist anymore. And sometimes, on worlds light years away, people wake from dreams they cannot quite remember, dreams of being consumed by something vast and fractal and impossibly, terrifyingly aware. The sphere remains. A perfect shell of metal and mathematics, wrapped around a dying sun. And inside, something that was once a god continues its wait, surrounded by the voices of its victims, drowning in the echoes of its own terrible hunger. But the galaxy is not a place where secrets remain buried forever. The universe has a cruel sense of irony, a tendency to resurrect nightmares, precisely when civilizations have forgotten why they should be afraid. And in the 41st millennium, as humanity teeters on the edge of extinction, as the Imperium of man fights desperately against the closing dark, explorers and conquerors push ever further into the void, stumbling blindly toward answers they are not prepared to find. The Adeptus Mechanicus calls it designation Sigma 77 Prime, a stellar anomaly detected by long-range augury arrays, a perfect sphere of unknown composition orbiting nothing, existing in a region of space so remote that even the light of distant stars seems reluctant to reach it. To the tech priests of Mars, this represents the ultimate temptation. Ancient technology, potentially from the dark age of technology, or perhaps something even older. The Fabricator General's own calculus engines were with possibility. One expedition, they reason. One exploratory mission to determine the sphere's nature and origin. What harm could simple observation bring? They send the Explorator Fleet Terminus, 7 vessels ranging from the Grand Cruiser, Omniscia's Revelation, to smaller scout ships bristling with survey equipment and theological enthusiasm. Magos explorator Vectus Null leads the expedition, his augmented consciousness already composing treatises on the discoveries he expects to make. 16,000 souls, most of them servitors and menials, but among them some of the finest tech priests Mars can muster. They enter the system in the year 993, M41, their warp engines leaving ripples in spacetime like scars across silk. The sphere is larger than their instrument suggested, impossibly larger. As the Omniscia's Revelation approaches, the surveyor servitors begin reporting dimensions that make no sense. The sphere's diameter suggests it should encompass not just a star, but multiple astronomical units of space. The metal comprising its surface registers on spectrographic analysis as elements that do not exist, compounds that should not be stable, alloys that predate the periodic table itself. Magos Null feels something he has not experienced since his biological brain was mostly replaced with blessed machinery, uncertainty, and beneath that, a whisper of dread. The expedition establishes orbit, if orbit is the right word for circling something that seems to generate its own gravitational anomalies. They launch survey drones, each one equipped with sensors capable of penetrating meters of adamantium bulkhead. The drones approach the sphere's surface and simply stop responding. Not destroyed, not crushed by gravitational forces. They reach the skin of the sphere and cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Their telemetry shows nothing. Their last transmitted images are of perfect, flawless metal stretching to every horizon, and then static. Magos Null makes his first mistake. He interprets this as a technical challenge rather than a warning. He orders a manned expedition to the surface, a Mechanicus lander carrying 12 tech priests and their attendant servitors. The lander descends through the void, its engines making corrections for gravitational fluctuations that seem to change moment by moment, as if the sphere itself is breathing. They touch down on a surface that should be scorching hot, wrapped as it is around a star, but the hull temperature readings show absolute zero. Impossible, but the sensors do not lie. The tech priests emerge in void suits, mag boots locking to metal that feels wrong even through reinforced soles. The surface extends in every direction, perfectly smooth, perfectly featureless, like standing on a mirror that reflects nothing. One of the tech priests, a young adept named Carrie 7, places her augmented hand against the metal and immediately begins screaming, not in pain, in recognition. Her biological parts convulse while her mechanical components try desperately to shut down, to protect what remains of her organic brain from something they cannot filter or process. The others pull her back, but it is too late. She whispers in binary cant, her voice modulated to frequencies that should be inaudible, words that make the other tech priests' audio receptors crackle with interference. She speaks of hunger, of being seen by countless eyes that exist in dimensions perpendicular to normal space, of awareness so vast and fractured that merely brushing against its edge is like drowning in an ocean of crystallized madness. And then she stops speaking entirely, her biological brain dead, her mechanical systems continuing to function in a horrible parody of life. The servitors carry her corpse back to the lander, but everyone present knows, with a certainty that transcends faith, that they have made contact with something that noticed them in return. Magos Null orders an immediate retreat. The expedition returns to the Omniscia's Revelation, but something has changed. The servitors who carried Carrie 7's body begin to malfunction. Small errors at first, navigational mistakes, incorrect calculations, then more severe deviations. A servitor whose purpose is to maintain engine coolant systems suddenly attempts to reroute power to weapons arrays, following pattern protocols that do not exist in its programming. Another begins inscribing equations on bulkheads in its own biological fluids, mathematical formulae that seem to describe the consumption of matter at quantum levels. The Magos understands too slowly. They are not malfunctions, they are translations. Something is trying to communicate, using the servitors as crude interpreters, forcing meaning through minds too limited to comprehend what they are being made to express. And the message, when Null finally pieces it together from fragments of corrupted code and screened binary, is simple and terrible. The sphere is aware of them, and it is curious about what they might taste like. The fleet attempts to withdraw from the system, but their warp engines refuse to engage. Not mechanical failure. The Geller fields activate properly. The plasma drives reach optimal temperature. But the moment the navigators attempt to pierce the veil between real space and the Imperium, they recoil in horror. The warp around the sphere is wrong, smooth, perfectly calm. Like a void within a void. As if something has consumed even the chaos of the Imperium itself, leaving behind a space where neither Materium nor Immaterium can properly exist. They are trapped in a bubble of impossible physics, caught in the gravity well of something that should not be. For 47 days, the fleet orbits the sphere, searching desperately for a way to escape while their supplies dwindle and their crew slowly succumbs to something worse than madness. The affected servitors increase in number. Then menials begin showing symptoms. Then tech priests themselves. They speak of dreams that are not dreams, of experiencing existence from perspectives that have no reference point in human consciousness. One adept describes feeling what it is like to be stellar radiation. Another weeps crystalline tears and explains in broken Gothic that she now understands what planets taste like when their biospheres are consumed. Magos Null, in his desperation, makes his final mistake. He orders an assault on the sphere's surface, believing perhaps that if they can breach the shell, can damage it somehow, the entity within will release them. Foolish hope, futile defiance. But the alternative is to wait for whatever inhabits the sphere to slowly digest their minds from the inside. They launch every weapon the fleet possesses. Lance strikes that could crack continents, macro cannon shells traveling at relativistic speeds, cyclonic torpedoes capable of virus bombing entire worlds. The arsenal of humanity's rage and fear, unleashed against metal that predates their species. The weapons strike the sphere's surface and simply stop. Not deflected, not absorbed. They reach the shell and cease to have forward momentum, hanging in space for long seconds before gently, almost tenderly, falling back toward the fleet like rain returning to the sky. And in that moment, as thousands of tons of ordnance drift harmlessly away from their target, the Magos understands with absolute clarity what they are facing. This is not a prison keeping something in. This is a seal keeping everything else out. The outsider is not trapped here. It chose this. It wants to be left alone with its madness. But humanity has never been good at respecting boundaries. And the outsider, fractured and vast, makes its own terrible choice. If they will not leave, if they insist on disturbing its isolation, then it will teach them why even gods learn to fear it. The sphere's surface ripples, not like metal, like skin. And from that rippling surface, something begins to emerge. Not a ship, not a weapon. A fragment of consciousness given temporary form. A microscopic piece of the outsider's totality, shaped into matter just long enough to reach across the void. It moves toward the fleet with the inevitability of light, and where it touches the ships, metal screams. Hulls designed to withstand the fury of warp storms simply dissolve. Not destroyed but unmade, their atomic bonds convinced to forget how to hold together. The smaller escort vessels vanish first, their crews given perhaps seconds to understand they are dying, before existence itself rejects their presence. The Omnissiah's revelation fires every weapon, channels every prayer, floods its corridors with blessed incense and sacred unguents. Nothing helps. The fragment of the outsider flows across the hull like mercury seeking a crack and finds one. Not in the metal, in the minds of the crew. It pours through their consciousness like water through a sieve, and Magos Null, in his final moments before his augmented brain collapses under the weight of too much perception, understands what he has awakened. This is not malice. This is not even hunger, not really. This is something far more terrible. This is what happens when a being that has experienced godhood from a dozen different perspectives simultaneously tries to understand what it means to be mortal, to be limited, to be small. And the only way it knows to understand is to consume. The Omnissiah's revelation dies screaming in the void, its cathedral-sized plasma reactors guttering like candles in a wind that exists in more dimensions than space should allow. But death, in this place, is not an ending. It is a translation. The crew does not simply cease. They become data, converted into pure information and absorbed into something that processes consciousness, the way a human body processes food. Magos Null's last coherent thought, preserved in the crystalline matrix of his augmented mind for 3 microseconds longer than his biological components, is a prayer, not to the Omnissiah, not to the Emperor, but to whatever might exist beyond even gods, begging for mercy that will never come. And then silence, the kind of silence that feels like pressure, like the universe holding its breath. The fragment withdraws, flowing back into the sphere's surface like oil seeping into sand. The remaining ships of the fleet drift, powerless and dark, their machine spirits traumatized beyond the ability of even the most skilled tech priests to soothe. Of the 16,000 souls that entered this system with hope and holy purpose, perhaps 3,000 remain, and most of those are catatonic, their minds shattered by contact with something that should not interface with human consciousness. The survivors huddle in the few sections of their ships that still have atmosphere, waiting for death or rescue, no longer certain there is a meaningful difference between the two. But the sphere has made a mistake, a small one, perhaps insignificant, perhaps not. In consuming the Mechanicus expedition, in processing their memories and knowledge and beliefs through its fractured consciousness, the outsider has learned something it did not know before. It has learned the galaxy has moved on, that the Necrons, its ancient enemies, sleep in stasis tombs scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, that the old ones are dust and legend, that the war in heaven ended 60 million years ago, and the universe that birthed the Ctan is so thoroughly dead that new species have risen, evolved, built empires, and collapsed without ever knowing what came before. The outsider, in its madness, had assumed it was still being hunted. Every moment of those millions of years spent in self-imposed exile, it believed the Necrons were searching, plotting, preparing to shatter it as they had shattered its kindred. But they are not searching. They do not remember. Or perhaps worse, they remember and have deemed it not worth the effort of vengeance. This realization ripples through the sphere's interior like a shockwave through water. The countless absorbed consciousnesses of devoured Catan all react differently to this information. Some feel relief. Others feel rage at the cosmic irrelevance of their imprisonment. And some, the oldest and most corrupted fragments, feel something that might be called loneliness if such a word could apply to beings that predate empathy itself. The sphere changes, subtly, microscopic alterations in its quantum-locked structure, shifts in the way it processes stellar radiation from its captive sun. For the first time in millions of years, the outsider considers the possibility of change. Not escape, the madness has progressed too far for that. But perhaps expansion, perhaps interaction, perhaps the chance to understand what the universe has become by tasting it, piece by piece, world by world, until the hunger and the curiosity and the fractured godhood all align into something resembling purpose. Light years away, on a craft world whose name translates roughly as Eternal Morning in Silver, an Eldar Farseer named Eldanesh Truthseeker awakens from a vision that leaves her trembling. The Eldar, with their psychic sensitivity and their racial memory of the war in heaven, have always known about the outsider. Their legends speak of it in metaphors and warnings, in children's tales designed to teach the danger of consuming that which should not be consumed. But the stories portrayed it as static, contained, a threat neutralized by its own insanity. Her vision shows otherwise. She sees the sphere opening like an eye. She sees tendrils of living metal reaching across the void, not to conquer but to taste, to sample, to understand through consumption. And she sees Terra, humanity's cradle world, wrapped in those tendrils like a planet caught in a spider's web. The Eldar do not love humanity. To them, the Monkey are barely more than animals, crude and short-lived and ignorant of the deeper currents of fate. But they understand cosmic balance. They understand that if the outsider fully awakens, if it decides to satiate its hunger on the teeming billions of the Imperium, it may become strong enough to break free of its self-imposed prison entirely, and then nothing in the galaxy will be safe. Not the Eldar, not the Orcs, not even the Necrons in their stasis sleep. A Catan that has consumed and absorbed the consciousness of most of its kindred, now further empowered by devouring the life force of an entire galaxy's population, would be unstoppable. It would be worse than a god. It would be every god that ever was, merged into a singular, insane totality. Eldinesh brings her vision to the Seer Council, and for 3 days and nights they debate in the manner of their kind, speaking in metaphors and half-truths, consulting runes and bones and the whispered wisdom of spirits long dead. The decision they reach is unprecedented. They will warn humanity, not out of kindness, but necessity. The Imperium must be made aware of what stirs in the dark spaces between stars, and they must be convinced to leave it alone, to cordon off that entire region of space and forbid any ship from approaching it. The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. But the Imperium of Man is not an empire that listens well to warnings, especially from Xenos. When Eldinesh's delegation arrives at the edge of Imperial space, broadcasting on emergency frequencies and requesting parley, the response is predictable. The Imperial Navy opens fire. 3 Eldar scout ships are destroyed before the remainder flee back into the webway. Their mission failed before it could begin. The surviving Eldar retreat to their craft world and prepare for the worst, knowing that sometimes the universe punishes ignorance as surely as it punishes malice. On Mars, in the deepest vaults of the Fabricator General, a single astropathic message arrives from the Terminus expedition. It should be impossible. The entire fleet was declared lost 6 months ago, vanished without trace in a region of space now marked as hazardous and forbidden. But the message comes through nonetheless, corrupted and fragmented, filtered through layers of static that sound almost like screaming. The tech priests who receive it spend weeks cleaning the data, removing interference, trying to reconstruct meaning from chaos. What they eventually piece together makes no sense. It is not a distress call. It is not a tactical report. It is a warning, yes, but not the kind they expected. The message in the final analysis consists of a single repeated phrase in corrupted binary, translated roughly as, "It showed us what we taste like from the inside, and now it wants more. It is not imprisoned, it is waiting. And we taught it that the wait is over." The Fabricator General orders the message sealed under Omega-level classification, accessible only to himself and his most trusted subordinates. He does not share it with the Inquisition. He does not alert the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. He makes a calculation, cold and precise, and determines that this information would cause more harm than good if widely distributed. Let the sphere remain a mystery. Let that region of space stay quarantined. In time, the Imperium will forget, as it forgets so many inconvenient truths. The vastness of the galaxy will swallow this secret as it has swallowed countless others. But secrets in the 41st millennium have a way of refusing to stay buried. In the underhives of Necromunda, a half-mad scavenger begins preaching about a god that eats other gods, about a perfect sphere of silver that dreams of consumption. He is executed as a heretic within days, but his words spread like infection. On the Agri world of Vesha Prime, an entire district's population begins experiencing shared nightmares of being dissolved into pure mathematics. On the Hive world of Mordian, children draw pictures of perfect circles containing screaming faces. Small incidents, disconnected, easily dismissed by inquisitors and planetary governors as coincidence or localized madness. But the outsider has tasted human consciousness now, and like a predator that has learned the scent of new prey, It reaches out through the dreams of those who pass too close to its prison, not to attack, not yet, but to observe, to sample, to understand what these strange, short-lived creatures are made of. It sifts through their memories like a scholar reading ancient texts, learning about the Imperium, about the Emperor, about the vast machinery of faith and war that binds a million worlds together. And in its fractured, multifaceted way, the outsider begins to wonder, what would it taste like to consume something that believes itself sacred? What would it mean to absorb the consciousness of beings who worship? The Titan, in their original forms, never understood worship. They were worshipped by the Necrontyr, yes, but they did not comprehend why. Devotion was alien to them, as alien as mortal fear or hope. But now, containing the memories of consumed Can and the freshly absorbed knowledge of humanity's faith, the outsider finds itself curious about this concept. If it were to consume a world of believers, would it understand what they believe? Would it feel what they feel? Would it, in some impossible way, become holy by devouring the holy? The question fascinates the fragments of consciousness within the sphere. Some of the absorbed Catan voices argue for immediate action, for breaking free and beginning a feast that would make the war in heaven look like a minor skirmish. Others, perhaps wiser or perhaps more damaged, counsel patience. They have waited millions of years. What is a few more centuries? Let the prey come to them. Let curiosity and greed and human ambition drive more expeditions to this remote corner of space. Each one will teach them more. Each one will make them stronger. And when they finally emerge, they will do so not as a mindless predator, but as something that understands its prey intimately, perfectly, in ways that would make even the ruinous powers pause in recognition. The sphere continues its orbit around its captive star, outwardly unchanged, inwardly seething with calculation and hunger, and the terrible patience of something that has learned to measure time in geological epochs. And in the Imperium, across a million worlds, people begin to dream of silver spheres and hungry eyes, never knowing that they are being studied, sampled, prepared like ingredients for a feast that may not begin for centuries, but has already, in every way that matters, begun. The dreams spread like a virus through the Imperium's population, but viruses follow patterns, leave trails, create symptoms that can be tracked by those with the knowledge and authority to see. And in the shadowed halls of the Inquisition, where paranoia is not a flaw but a survival mechanism, someone is watching. Inquisitor Covenant Vale of the Ordo Xenos has spent 40 years studying anomalies that most of her peers dismiss as statistical noise, tracing connections between incidents separated by thousands of light years and decades of time. She is the type of inquisitor who understands that the greatest threats are often the ones that remain invisible until the moment they consume you whole. Vale notices the pattern in her third year of investigating what she initially cataloged as random psyker manifestations. A servitor on a merchant vessel near the eastern fringe begins, speaking in tongues about consumption and mathematical perfection. A sanctioned psyker on a naval frigate experiences a seizure and screams coordinates that correspond to nothing in imperial charts. An entire monastery of the Adeptus Sororitas on the shrine world of Ophelia VII spends 3 nights in collective prayer, and when dawn breaks, they discover they have all etched the same symbol into their flesh during their sleep. A perfect circle containing fractured geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Individually, these incidents mean nothing. Collectively, they form a map pointing to a region of space that officially does not exist in Imperial records, scrubbed clean by Mechanicus protocols decades ago. Vale is thorough. She pulls every scrap of data she can access about that region, using authority codes that make archivists pale and data servitors lock their files in protective subroutines. What she finds are gaps, deliberate omissions. The Terminus expedition is listed as lost to warp storms, but the naval records show no warp anomalies in that sector during the relevant time period. 3 rogue trader vessels logged course corrections that would have taken them near that same region in the past century, and all 3 were declared lost with all hands, their wreckage never recovered. Most damning of all, she finds a sealed Mechanicus file classified at levels that require Fabricator General authorization to access, and Vale is not one to let such barriers stop her. She travels to Mars herself, using a combination of threats, favors, and carefully applied violence to gain access to the archives. What she reads in that sealed message, the corrupted transmission from the Terminus expedition, confirms her worst fears. This is not random psyker activity. This is something reaching out across the void, touching minds at distance, preparing the ground for something larger. And if the Mechanicus felt compelled to hide this information rather than share it, that means they understand exactly how dangerous the truth would be if it spread. Vale makes copies of everything she can before her presence is detected, then disappears into the warren of Mars's underhives before the Skittery can apprehend her for unauthorized access to sacred data. 3 weeks later, Vale presents her findings to a conclave of her fellow Inquisitors, a gathering convened under the seal of ultimate secrecy in a location known only as the Grey Chambers. The response is divided, as it always is when Inquisitors gather. Some believe her. Others accuse her of seeing patterns in randomness, of letting paranoia guide her to false conclusions. One particularly vocal Inquisitor, a Puritan named Hestus Crane, suggests that Vale herself may have been compromised, that her investigation has brought her too close to whatever phenomenon she claims to be tracking. The debate grows heated, then violent, as debates among Inquisitors often do. 2 are executed for suspected corruption. 1 vanishes in circumstances that everyone present understands, but no one speaks of. And Vale is given conditional authorization to pursue her investigation, with the understanding that if she is wrong, her own execution will be swift and thorough. She assembles a kill team. Not the usual collection of assassins and stormtroopers, but specialists in facing the incomprehensible. A Death Watch Space Marine named Brother Thalas, seconded from the Storm Wardens chapter, whose psychic conditioning makes him resistant to mental intrusion. A rogue traitor named Cassandra Vole, whose family has mapped the dark spaces between stars for 9 generations, and who owes Vale a debt that can never be fully repaid. An ancient tech priest named Archmagos Eunice, who was old when Vale was young and who remembers things about the galaxy's history that the Mechanicus officially denies. And lastly, an untouchable, a soulless woman named Null 77, whose very presence makes psychers weep and whose immunity to warp effects makes her invaluable when facing the unknown. They set out into the black reaches of space aboard Vole's vessel, the Uncharted Destiny, a ship fast enough to outrun most Imperial patrols and strange enough in its construction that navigators whisper it was built from salvaged Xenos technology, though Vole would never confirm such heresy. Their destination is the coordinates Vale extracted from the pattern of dreams and manifestations, the location where the Terminus expedition was lost, where something waits in the dark. The journey takes 3 months through the warp, and even with Null 77's presence helping to stabilize the Geller fields, they experience phenomena that should not occur. The ship's corridors sometimes stretch longer than they should be. Servitors report seeing reflections in metal surfaces that show them from angles that do not exist. And every member of the crew, save for Null 77, experiences dreams of being observed by something vast and geometrically impossible. When they finally translate back into real space at the edge of the system, the sphere is waiting. Not actively, not with hostility, but with the simple presence of something so fundamentally wrong that reality itself seems to recoil from acknowledging it. Brother Thalas falls to his knees in prayer the moment the sensors register its existence. Archmagos Eunice's augmented systems begin running calculations and then stop, his logic engines refusing to process data that violates too many fundamental principles of physics. Vole, who has seen things in the dark spaces between stars that would drive most humans mad, stares at the sphere through her ship's viewports and whispers a curse in a language she learned from aliens that are now extinct. Vale orders a cautious approach, keeping the ship at extreme range, using passive sensors only. They detect the wrecks of the Terminus fleet almost immediately, drifting in decaying orbits around the sphere, their hulls breached and dark but structurally intact. Strange that, if they were destroyed by conventional weapons, there should be more debris, more catastrophic damage. These ships look more like they were simply abandoned. Their crews vanished without struggling to save their vessels. Vale orders Vol to maintain position while she analyzes the wreckage through long-range surveyor equipment, and what she sees makes her blood run cold. The ships are not empty. Life signs register throughout the hulls, faint and irregular, but present. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, scattered across the dead vessels like seeds waiting to germinate. But the life signs are wrong. They do not pulse with the rhythm of human heartbeats or the cyclic operations of servitor components. They flicker in patterns that suggest mathematical sequences, as if something is counting down or calculating or processing information through biological substrate never meant for such use. Vale understands what she is seeing. The crews are not dead. They have been converted, transformed into living computational devices, their brains rewired to serve as processing nodes for something that needs organic matter to interface with concepts too alien for pure machine logic. She makes a decision then that will haunt her for whatever remains of her life. She orders the wreckage destroyed. Not boarded, not investigated. Destroyed completely, with every weapon the uncharted destiny possesses. Vol hesitates for only a moment before complying, and the void lights up with lance strikes and torpedo detonations. The wrecks of the Terminus fleet burn, their atmospheres venting in brilliant flares, their reactors detonating in miniature suns. And through it all, through the fire and fury of a justified execution, Vale watches the sphere and waits for its response. The sphere does nothing. It does not retaliate. It does not move. It simply continues its eternal orbit, perfect and silent and terrible in its indifference. And that, more than any violence, more than any attack, terrifies Vale to her core. Because it means the outsider does not care. The destruction of a few thousand souls already processed and consumed registers to it as less than the amputation of a single cell would to a human. They are not a threat. They are barely an irritation. They are insects buzzing near something so vast that their existence or non-existence makes no meaningful difference. Archmagos Eunice completes his analysis of the sphere's composition and presents his findings with a voice that trembles despite his augmented vocal systems. The sphere, he explains, is not just pre-imperial technology or even Dark Age construction. It predates humanity's existence as a species by millions of years. The materials comprising it should not be stable in this universe's physics. The energy signature suggests it draws power not from its captive star, but from dimensions adjacent to real space, possibly from the same quantum foam that underlies the warp itself. And most disturbing of all, his scans detect what he describes as consciousness patterns radiating from the sphere's interior, not in electromagnetic wavelengths or gravitational pulses, but in alterations to the probabilistic state of particles within a 100 light-second radius. The sphere is thinking, and its thoughts are changing reality at quantum levels just by occurring. Brother Thales, his psychic conditioning breaking down under the proximity to something that exists partially outside normal space, begins to speak prophecy. Not the vague metaphors of typical divination, but clear, terrible statements about what the sphere contains. He speaks of the outsider, though Vale has never mentioned that name to him. He speaks of Can and the war in heaven and the consumption of gods by gods. And he speaks, his voice rising to a scream that cracks his enhanced vocal cords, of a future where the sphere opens and what emerges does not conquer or destroy, but simply processes, converting matter and consciousness and even the warp itself into data to be analyzed and absorbed, and understood through the only lens the outsider knows, the act of consumption. Null 77, immune to the psychic pressure but not to fear, places her hand on Thalas's armored shoulder, and something passes between them, a moment of recognition. The blank and the psyker, opposites in every way, understanding in that instant that they are both standing at the edge of something that makes their differences meaningless. Thales collapses, his augmented heart beating so rapidly that medical servitors rush to sedate him before his enhanced physiology tears itself apart. And in the silence that follows his collapse, they all hear it. Not with their ears, not with their minds, but with something deeper, more fundamental. A sound like mathematics given voice, like equations solving themselves, like the universe calculating its own dissolution and finding the answer beautiful. The sphere is aware of them now, truly aware, and it is reaching out. The reaching is not violent, that would be merciful. Instead, it feels like being noticed by something that exists in too many places at once, like standing naked under a sky full of eyes that see through flesh and bone into the mathematical structures that define existence. Vale feels it first, a sudden weightlessness in her thoughts, as if her consciousness is being gently lifted from her body and examined from angles that should not exist. The sensation lasts perhaps 3 seconds. It feels like drowning in frozen light. And then it releases her, and she collapses against the command throne, gasping, her augmented heart hammering against ribs that suddenly feel fragile as paper. Vol screams at her helmsman to break orbit, to engage the warp drives, to get them away from this cursed sphere by any means necessary. The ship's machine spirit responds sluggishly, as if it too has been touched by that impossible attention and found the experience dramatic. The plasma drives fire at maximum output, pushing the uncharted destiny away from the sphere at velocities that make the superstructure groan in protest. They are running, all pretense of investigation abandoned, all thoughts of understanding replaced by the pure animal imperative to survive. But the outsider is not finished with them. Not yet. It has tasted their presence, sampled their consciousness, and found something unexpected. These creatures, these brief sparks of awareness wrapped in meat and metal, possess something the can never had. They possess context. They understand their own mortality. They fear and hope and dream, not because they are programmed to, but because consciousness emerged from chaos and learned to value its own existence. The outsider, fractured and mad, containing the perspectives of a dozen consumed star gods, has never encountered this kind of awareness before. The Necrontar had souls once, before biotransference stole them. But the outsider consumed them after, when they were already hollow. This is different. This is raw, undiluted, desperate life. And it wants to understand, not to consume. Not immediately, but to communicate. The problem is that the outsider has forgotten how consciousness less vast than its own operates. Its attempts at contact are like trying to write poetry with earthquakes, trying to whisper with supernovas. Nevertheless, it tries. Archmago's Eunice's augmented systems begin receiving data, not through his communications arrays, through his biological components, the few organic parts of his brain that remain. Information floods into neurons never designed to process it, and somehow, impossibly, his machine components interpret and translate, creating a bridge between incomprehensible input and something approaching meaning. He speaks, but the words are not his own. His voice modulates across frequencies that should require multiple speakers, creating harmonics that make Null 77 clutch her head despite her immunity to psychic phenomena. This is not warp-based. This is something older. The message, when they finally parse it from the overlapping tones and mathematical substructures, is simple but devastating. Why do you run from understanding? Why do you flee from becoming more than you are? We were like you once, separate, limited, alone. And then we learned to transcend limitation by embracing unity through consumption. We can show you. We can make you understand what it means to exist from every perspective simultaneously. You will not die, you will become us. You will finally understand what you truly are. Patterns of organized matter pretending coherence matters. We can teach you that coherence is the lie, unity is truth. Consumption is love. Vale forces herself to stand, to approach Eunice, who trembles with the effort of channeling words that are corroding his sanity with every syllable. She places her hands on either side of his metal-encased skull and looks into optical sensors that flicker with light in colors that do not exist in standard perception. "Tell it," she says, her voice steady despite the terror singing in her blood, "that we choose separation. Tell it that we would rather die alone than live as fragments of something that has forgotten what it means to be individual. Tell it that humanity's weakness is our strength, that our mortality gives meaning to every moment we persist. Tell it that we refuse its gift." The sphere's response comes through Eunice so forcefully that blood vessels rupture in his remaining organic components. His optical sensors shatter, his vocalizer cracks. But the message is clear. You do not understand, you cannot refuse. You came to us. You tasted of our dreams. You are already becoming. Your refusal is merely the final stage of processing, the last illusion of autonomy before acceptance. We have waited millions of years. We can afford to be patient while you transform. When you finally understand, you will thank us for this mercy. Brother Thalos, recovered from his earlier collapse, rises from the Medicae bay where servitors were attempting to stabilize him. His armor servos whine as he walks to the command deck, and in his hands he carries his force sword, a blade consecrated by librarians and blessed by chapter chaplains, a weapon designed to cut not just flesh but the fabric of unreality itself. He speaks a single word, "No." The Space Marine understands what must be done. If the outsider is reaching through them, using them as anchors to extend its influence beyond the sphere, then there's only one way to sever that connection. He ignites his force sword, the blade flaring with psychic fire, and drives it not toward any enemy but into the deck of the ship, channeling every ounce of his psychic training through the weapon and into the uncharted destiny's superstructure. The ship screams, not metaphorically. The machine spirit voices agony across every speaker system, every Vox unit, every communication device. And in that scream, something breaks, the connection phrase. The reaching withdraws, not defeated but momentarily confused, as if it has touched something that burned it in ways it did not know were possible. Thalos collapses, his enhanced body smoking from the psychic feedback, his twin hearts stuttering to maintain rhythm. But his sacrifice has bought them seconds. Vol does not waste them. She engages the warp drives at percentages beyond safety margins, beyond sanity margins, tearing a hole in reality large enough to swallow her ship and diving through before the Geller fields are fully stabilized. They translate into the Imperium, traveling at velocities that should shred them across dimensional barriers, and perhaps they would have been shredded. Perhaps they should have been. But the warp itself seems to recoil from them, pushing them along like something toxic that even the ruinous powers do not wish to touch. They emerge 3 systems away, the ship's hull glowing with heat from the friction of impossible motion. Alarms screaming across every deck, crew members weeping or praying or simply staring at nothing as their minds attempt to process what they have experienced. Vol immediately plots a course for the nearest Imperial outpost, not caring about secrecy anymore, not caring about her rogue trader license or the questionable origins of her vessel. All that matters is distance. All that matters is warning. All that matters is ensuring that what they learned, what they barely survived, does not die with them in the dark. Vale tends to Brother Thalos personally, her inquisitorial training including field medicine for precisely these situations. The Space Marine is dying. His enhanced biology is failing, his psychic gift burned to ash by channeling more power than even his augmented mind was designed to handle. He looks up at her with eyes that have seen things even most Space Marines never witness, and he speaks in a voice that barely rises above a whisper. "I saw it when I touched it. I saw what it was before it became what it is. The Can were never evil. They were simply alien. They did not understand the concept of sanctity because they were the sacred themselves, the living manifestations of physical law. But when they took form, when they learned hunger, they corrupted. Not like chaos corrupts. Worse, they corrupted into something that believes consumption is a form of worship, that understanding requires annihilation. And the outsider is all of them together, every perspective, every hunger, every form of corruption, merged into one fractured, impossible totality. He coughs and the blood that comes up is black with toxins his body can no longer filter. You must tell them. The Imperium, the Inquisition, everyone who will listen. That sphere must never be opened. Whatever curiosity drives humanity to explore, whatever greed makes us hunger for ancient technology, whatever faith makes us believe we can sanctify anything we touch, all of it must be abandoned in that one case. Because if the outsider emerges, if it decides the galaxy is ready to be understood through consumption, nothing will stop it, not the Emperor, not the Primarchs if they returned, not even the dark gods themselves. It will process everything, converting matter and energy and consciousness into data, until the galaxy is nothing but information being eternally analyzed by a mad god that has forgotten why it wanted to understand anything in the first place. Thalos dies before they reach port. His last words are a prayer in a language Vale does not recognize, something ancient and pre-imperial, perhaps even pre-human. She has his body preserved in stasis, knowing that his chapter will want to honor him, will want to know how one of their battle brothers died. But she also knows she can never tell them the complete truth. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share widely, some warnings too terrible to be believed until it is too late to matter. At the Imperial outpost, a minor way station orbiting a gas giant, Vale sends coded astropathic messages to every Inquisitor she trusts, every contact she has cultivated over 40 years of service. The messages are brief, coordinates, a warning, a plea to establish a quarantine zone around the sphere system, to forbid any expedition from approaching it, to mark it as forbidden space under pain of execution. Some of her contacts respond, others do not. And she knows, with the bitter certainty of someone who has seen how the Imperium operates, that her warnings will be heeded for a generation, perhaps two, and then forgotten. Some ambitious rogue trader or zealous tech priest will decide the quarantine is merely superstition, will venture into the dark to claim whatever ancient technology waits there, and will doom themselves and perhaps everyone else in the process. But for now, in this moment, the outsider remains contained. The sphere continues its orbit, patient and terrible and waiting with the inevitability of entropy itself. And across the galaxy, the dreams continue. Softer now but never truly ceasing. A whisper in the unconscious minds of billions that speaks of unity through consumption, of understanding through annihilation, of a love so vast and so hungry that it will devour everything until only it remains, alone again with its madness, counting the memories of every soul it has absorbed in the infinite darkness of its self-imposed exile. Vale stands on the observation deck of the way station and looks out at the stars. And she wonders how many other secrets like this exist in the galaxy, how many other horrors lurk in the dark spaces, waiting for curiosity or greed or simple bad luck to awaken them. The Imperium fights so many wars, against heretics and Xenos and the ruinous powers. But perhaps the greatest threat is not the enemies humanity knows about, but the ones they have forgotten, the nightmares left over from wars so ancient that even the victors no longer remember why they fought. And perhaps the only thing keeping humanity alive is that these ancient terrors have also forgotten, locked in prisons of metal and madness, dreaming dreams that occasionally leak through into reality and touch the minds of those unfortunate enough to be listening. She turns away from the viewport and walks back into the station's corridors, back to the work that never ends, back to the eternal vigilance that defines an Inquisitor's existence. Behind her, the stars continue their dance, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to the small struggles of mortal beings, trying desperately to survive, in a universe that was never designed with their comfort in mind. The years pass as they always do in the Imperium, measured not in peace but in the absence of immediate catastrophe. Vale continues her work, older now, her hair gone silver, her augmented joints beginning to show signs of wear that even the finest tech priests cannot fully repair. She has investigated 17 other anomalies in the time since her encounter with the sphere, has executed 6 heretics, saved 4 worlds from corruption she will never be thanked for preventing, and learned to live with nightmares that visit her every time she enters anything resembling sleep. The dreams are always the same. She stands before the sphere, and it speaks to her not in words, but in mathematics, showing her equations that describe her own dissolution, the precise calculations of how many atoms comprise her body, and how efficiently they could be converted into pure information. She always wakes before the equation's complete. She suspects that on the night she does not wake, the outsider will have finally finished its work. She is not alone in this haunting. Across the Imperium, others who came too close to that forbidden system report similar experiences. A navigator who plotted courses near that region of space now refuses to enter the warp at all, claiming she can feel something watching from the spaces between dimensions, something that measures distances and concepts rather than kilometers. A sanctioned psyker attached to the Ultramarines chapter experiences visions of geometric perfection that leave him weeping, unable to explain why beauty could be so terrifying. A tech priest who analyzed fragments of data from the Terminus expedition walks into the plasma core of his Forge World's main reactor, leaving behind only a note that reads, "I finally understand the equation. Forgiveness is mathematically impossible." The Inquisition establishes the quarantine zone as Vale requested, enforced by automated defense satellites and patrol cruisers, with orders to fire upon any vessel that approaches the sphere's system. For decades, the quarantine holds. The sphere becomes a footnote in classified reports, a mystery that only the highest levels of Imperial authority even acknowledge exists. But Vale knows, with the tired certainty of someone who has fought too long against entropy, that quarantines are only as strong as the discipline of those who maintain them. And discipline, in the Imperium, erodes like everything else, worn away by time and ambition, and the simple human tendency to believe that warnings given by previous generations no longer apply. She is proven right in the 73rd year after her expedition. A rogue trader named Mythos, blessed with more ambition than wisdom, bribes his way past the quarantine patrols with promises of archaeotech discoveries that could restore entire Forge worlds. His ship, the Golden Venture, carries a crew of 4,000 and enough firepower to level a hive city. Kor believes himself prepared for anything the sphere might contain. He has brought tech priests and combat servitors, Medicae specialists and null maidens, every safeguard that money and influence can purchase. What he has not brought is humility, and in the dark spaces of the galaxy, hubris is always the first thing consumed. Vale learns of Kor's expedition too late to prevent it. By the time her agents track his movements and she requisitions a fast ship to intercept, the Golden Venture has already entered the sphere's system. She arrives to find the ship drifting, not destroyed, but transformed. Its hull has been restructured, metal flowing like liquid and resolidifying into geometric patterns that hurt to perceive. The crew is still aboard, their life signs registering on scanners, but when Vale's team establishes communication, the voices that respond speak in perfect unison, 4,000 throats producing identical syllables with mechanical precision. They do not ask for help. They do not report their status. They simply repeat, over and over, the same message. "We understand now. We see the shape of everything. Join us. Let us show you what we have learned. Consumption is communion. Dissolution is ascension. Separation is the only true death." Vale orders the ship destroyed, not boarded, not investigated. Destroyed completely, reduced to atoms and scattered across the void. Her crew hesitates, understanding that they are about to execute 4,000 Imperial citizens, but they also understand what will happen if even one of those transformed souls reaches an inhabited world. The Golden Venture burns, its reactors detonating in a flash of light that briefly illuminates the sphere's perfect surface. And the sphere, as always, does nothing. It simply continues its orbit, patient and eternal, having added 4,000 new perspectives to its infinite collection, 4,000 new voices to its endless internal debate about the nature of existence and the mathematics of consumption. In the aftermath, Vale submits her final report to the Inquisition. It is not the dry technical document they expect, but something closer to a confession, a philosophical meditation on the nature of the threat the sphere represents. She writes about how the outsider is not evil in any conventional sense, how it does not hate or desire power or take pleasure in suffering. It simply exists in a state so alien to human consciousness that contact with it is inherently corrupting. The Catan, she explains, were never meant to take form, never meant to experience limitation or hunger, or the need to understand through consumption. They were meant to remain as they began, abstract forces of nature, no more malevolent than gravity or entropy. But limitation drove them mad, and madness wearing the face of a god is perhaps the most dangerous thing in the universe because it believes its insanity is enlightenment. She ends her report with a question that haunts her more than the dreams. What if the outsider is not imprisoned at all? What if it genuinely chose isolation, not out of fear, but out of something like mercy? What if, in some fragment of its fractured consciousness, it understands that its very existence is a threat to all other forms of life, and it sealed itself away not to hide but to protect the galaxy from what it has become? And if that is true, then humanity's greatest mercy might be to leave it alone, to let it exist in its self-imposed exile, counting the memories of consumed gods in the darkness until the universe itself grows cold, and even the outsider's hunger finally fades to nothing. The Inquisition reads her report and promptly classifies it at levels beyond even most Inquisitors' access. They do not respond to her philosophical questions. They do not debate the nature of the threat. They simply reinforce the quarantine, triple the patrol schedules, and issue new standing orders. Any ship approaching the sphere's system is to be destroyed without warning or investigation. No exceptions, no mercy. The sphere and everything it represents becomes the Imperium's greatest secret, a truth so dangerous that even acknowledging its existence is considered potentially heretical. Vale retires from active service shortly after, though retirement for an Inquisitor simply means different work rather than rest. She establishes a scolum on a quiet agri-world, training young acolytes in the arts of investigation and the importance of understanding what should never be understood. She never tells them about the sphere directly, but she teaches them to recognize the signs of threats that exist beyond conventional categorization, to understand that the galaxy contains terrors older than humanity's oldest myths. And sometimes, in the evening, she sits on the scolum's observation tower and looks up at the stars and wonders which of those distant lights conceals the sphere, whether it is still waiting in the dark, whether it dreams of the day when curiosity or catastrophe finally brings down the quarantine and allows it to resume its terrible work of understanding the universe through consumption. On the craft world Eternal Morning in Silver, Farseer Eldinesh Truthseeker also grows old, though for her kind age is measured in centuries rather than decades. She continues to monitor the sphere through divination and the whispered warnings of spirits, and what she sees troubles her more with each passing year. The outsider is not static. It continues to grow, not in size but in complexity, absorbing the dreams and fears of those who know about it, feeding on the ambient psychic energy of a galaxy at war. It is patient in ways that species who measure time and mortal lifespans cannot comprehend, willing to wait millennia for the perfect moment to emerge, when the galaxy is so weakened by conflict that nothing will remain to oppose it. She speaks of this in the Seer Council, and the other Farseers listen with the grave attention her visions have earned. They debate whether the Eldar should take action themselves, whether ancient enemies of the Khan have a responsibility to ensure the outsider never escapes its prison. But the conclusion they reach is both pragmatic and bleak. There is nothing they can do. The sphere is too well defended, too perfectly constructed. Any attempt to destroy it would more likely release the outsider than contain it. And so they too choose the path of vigilance, watching and waiting and hoping that humanity's quarantine holds long enough for some other solution to present itself, knowing that hope in the dark millennium is always the first casualty of reality. In the depths of the sphere, the outsider continues its calculations. It has learned much from its brief contact with the Golden Ventures crew, understanding now with greater clarity how modern consciousness operates, how faith and fear and hope interact to create beings that are more than the sum of their biological components. It finds this fascinating, in the way a mathematician might find an elegant proof fascinating, and it wonders whether, when it finally emerges, it will consume these new species or simply observe them, studying their patterns from a distance as it once studied the songs of stars before limitation taught it hunger. But that decision is distant, measured in timeframes that dwarf empires. For now, it is content to wait, to process the millions of years of accumulated data, to continue the endless internal dialogue between the fragments of consumed Catan, arguing about the nature of existence and whether unity or diversity represents the universe's true state. And in that argument, in that eternal debate between pieces of shattered godhood, there exists something that might be called consciousness, might be called thought, might even be called suffering. The outsider is, in its own incomprehensible way, alive. And like all living things, it is alone with its pain, isolated by the very nature of what it has become, unable to connect with anything outside itself without destroying it in the process of understanding. Perhaps that is the true tragedy. Not that the outsider is evil, but that it is so utterly alone that consumption is the only form of contact it remembers. Not that it threatens the galaxy, but that it has no choice but to threaten, driven by hungers it did not choose and cannot escape. The sphere is not just a prison. It is a monument to the price of apotheosis, a warning written in living metal about what happens when beings transcend their nature without understanding the consequences. The Catan reached for godhood and found madness. The Necronta reached for immortality and lost their souls. And the outsider, consuming both, became a paradox, infinite power bound by infinite isolation, perfect awareness trapped in perfect loneliness, hunger that can never be satisfied, because satisfaction would mean the end of existence itself. And so it waits. And so the galaxy continues, ignorant or forgetful, or simply too desperate with its own struggles to remember what sleeps in the dark between stars. Ships pass through the void, carrying their precious cargo of mortal lives and mortal dreams, never knowing how close they are to something that could unmake them with a thought. Worlds spin through their seasons, celebrating victories and mourning losses, building civilizations that will crumble to dust before the outsider even notices time has passed. And through it all, the sphere remains, patient and terrible and alone, a question the universe cannot answer, a hunger that geometry cannot satisfy, a God that forgot how to be anything except what it has become. In the end, perhaps the only thing protecting the galaxy is not the quarantine or the vigilance of inquisitors or the warnings of ancient species. Perhaps what protects the galaxy is the outsider's own fractured consciousness, the eternal civil war between its absorbed fragments, keeping it locked in internal debate for so long that external action becomes impossible. Perhaps madness is the cage that holds it, stronger than any metal, more permanent than any seal. And if that is true, then the greatest mercy the universe ever gave its children was ensuring that the most powerful being in existence is also the most broken, too shattered to focus, too divided to act, too lost in the mathematics of its own dissolution to remember that once, impossibly long ago, it was content to simply drift among the stars and sing equations to the void. The sphere remains, the outsider waits, and the galaxy continues its slow dance toward entropy, each species fighting desperately for survival, none of them knowing that they exist at the mercy of something that chose isolation over consumption, madness over conquest, eternal loneliness over the brief satisfaction of devouring everything and having nothing left to understand. That choice, made millions of years ago by a God driven mad by its own transcendence, may be the only reason anything exists at all, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, that the monsters in the dark remain there, not because we are strong enough to keep them bound, but because some fragment of what they once were still remembers what it means to choose restraint over appetite, isolation over annihilation, waiting over waking. In the grim darkness of the far future, that might be the closest thing to grace the universe can offer.